If what you're doing is wrong for you, it will show up. Your own body will revolt. So automatically you begin to see this is really about meaning, isn't it? Not about becoming better adjusted to the world around me. If the world around me is sort of crazy and I adjust to it, what does that make me? Healthy relationship is kind of like an open-ended structure where you support the growth and development of both parties. I guess 95% of our life is on automatic pilot, where we just stimulus response, stimulus response, stimulus response. We can get through life unconsciously. But that's a waste of this journey, isn't it?
Hello, and I'm so honored, Dr. Hollis, that you accepted my invitation to talk with me. And it's my first time conducting this kind of interview about this kind of topics, especially. So I wanted to make a very brief introduction about you. Dr. James Hollis is a Jungian psychoanalyst who wrote about more than 18 books about topics of finding your life's purpose, living your authentic life, and very important and meaningful topics which resonated with me very much lately. And that's why I discovered your work on YouTube through books, and I could just say how meaningful and impactful they were for me. And my first question would be, how is your life? How are you? I know you suffered some health issues lately, and I see you on interviews all the time, keeping up the work. How have you been lately?
Well, I'm well enough. Thank you very much. Within a couple of weeks, I'll be 85 years old, so I'm just grateful to be here. But about 3 years ago, I had some elective surgeries, but then I had two cancers, and then perhaps as a result of those cancer treatments with the radiation and chemo and so forth, that I also my back started fracturing, so I had to have two major spinal surgeries. So 2 years ago, it was very dicey about whether I was going to be able to survive or not, but here I am, and I'm grateful to be here with you and happy to respond to any questions you have. So I continue to do my work because it's a calling, and one's task in life, I think, is decide what your life's calling is about. It need not be a career, need not be a job. It can be just stepping into your own perspective in life and having the courage to hold that with respect to others as well. And so I'm just doing what I've always done, and that is try to be a teacher, try to pass on what I've learned, and share the open questions that I continue to have about life, why we're here, what this is all about. And I might say, in a rather long-winded response to your question, I think life is about addressing large questions. We had them as children. Who am I? Who are you? What's this about? What am I to do with my life? How do I make my choices? And then we all, as creatures, have to begin to adapt to the world around us. And we lose contact with those large questions. So at some point in one's life, one has to come back to them because they continue to be asked inside of each of us, intrapsychically, whenever we run afoul of or cross purposes from where our life is supposed to be going as seen by our nature, not necessarily our environmental situation, then it's going to show up symptomatically as depression, troubling dreams, self-medication, and so forth. So I'm just happy to still be here, happy to be a partner with my wife and doing a work that I love and a work that demands a lot from me. But then that's what we're here for. Decide what's worth your investment and give yourself to it.
Thank you. I'm so glad that you are feeling good now and you are doing an very impactful and amazing work. And I should say, just to finish with it, that you are a big inspiration for many as a model to follow your passion and your task, so to say. Because lately, as I watch the world around me, and when I read your books and your works, and I self-reflect also, there are not many people around me who are quote unquote grown-ups who follow their task, who are authentic with themselves. And of course, I can see it in myself too, this space where I can grow up, where I can be more authentic, listening more to my soul and doing what we are supposed to do. So that's why you are very important example for that, for me and many. My question first is about big questions, of course. Um, how does one know what he should do in his life or her life, and what kind of work is it? Because for me, it was I liked camera, I liked filmmaking, I liked acting, but is it meaningful enough for the world, or should it be meaningful for me? Sorry for a long question, but
That's quite all right. Well, I think if we're doing what's truly meaningful for us, that's the best person we can share with others. In other words, if you are violating what is meaningful to you, it's going to show up in your relationships, whether at work or at home. Jung said something once that I think properly should haunt every parent. And he said, the greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parent. So wherever I'm stuck, my children will be stuck, or they'll be spending their life trying to get unstuck. So it's important for me to live my journey as best I can. Now, how do we do that? As I said, we are creatures of adaptation that allows us to survive and fit in and so forth. But we're also equipped with elemental systems inside of each of us. First of all, is the feeling function. In other words, one could do all the right things as your parents wish it, or your culture wishes it, or the employer wishes it, but it doesn't quite feel right inside. And that shows up in unconscious treatment plans, such as self-medication, or as I said, troubling dreams and so forth. We also have energy systems. We can mobilize our energy and have to every day, particularly Monday morning, which this happens to be when we're talking, at least in my part of the world. And, you know, it's important to be able to mobilize that energy to serve life's demands. At the same time, if you continue to put your energy in places that don't have meaning for you, it'll lead you to exhaustion and burnout and again, self-medication and so forth. Thirdly, we have dreams. As I said, I'm nearly 85, and I saw a sleep study recently that indicated that if you live to 80 years old, you will spend 6 years of your life dreaming, not sleeping. That could be up to a third of that time sleeping. So the body has to repair, but the psyche has to continue to process the magnitude of stimuli that come to us. And so 6 years of dreaming says this serves some vital process. And if we pay attention to our dreams over time, we begin to intuit. We're forced to recognize sooner or later there's something inside of me that knows me better than I know myself. It's what Jung called the self with a capital S, to distinguish it from the ego consciousness that I'm talking to you at this moment with. But the self, in some way, is creating its response to my life, and it will critique it. Fourthly, is the question of meaning, which is most important. If what you're doing is meaningful, then you can put up with sacrifices. In fact, sacrifices are often necessary to live a meaningful life. But if what you're doing is not meaningful, again, it leads to depression and burnout and so forth. And most of all, fifthly, is psychopathology. In other words, if what you're doing is wrong for you, it will show up. Your own body will revolt. Your psyche will revolt. And it's the collision between the natural instinctual desire to unfold in this world and how we're conducting our life and our environmental situation. And when these two forces collide, they often reach the surface as symptomatology. For example, depression. I began this process. My early life was spent as an academic. I was a professor of literature and philosophy. But at midlife, I experienced a depression. And for the first time in my life, I had to really recognize the autonomy of that intelligence inside that knew me better than I knew myself. And I had to ask a question that would have never occurred to me before, and that is, why has your psyche autonomously withdrawn its approval and support from the place where your consciousness is investing all this energy? What you've done is not wrong, but it requires some reframing, some different perspective. The one thing that's been consistent throughout my life is a respect for education. I came from a working class family. They worked hard to just meet next month's mortgage payment or rent payment. We had trouble having food on the table. I saw my parents suffer. I also knew there had to be some meaning in life that I had to try to address. And so I was grateful to my teachers to open larger worlds for me. I wanted to see where airplanes went. I'd heard about I grew up in America's heartland in the middle of the country, south of Chicago. And I wanted to see the ocean, wanted to see the world. And the teachers provided me an opening, an invitation. And so I think I became identified with teaching. The one thing that's been consistent throughout my life is a love of learning and the desire to share it with others. That's why we're talking here today. And I'm still working as a psychotherapist, a Jungian analyst. I was trained in Zurich. And as a result of that depression at midlife, I found myself needing to go back and deal with some of the traumas from childhood, some of the difficulties in life that I had sort of papered over. I also found a deepening interest in the autonomy of that psyche that, as I said, withdrew its support at midlife from me. So underneath all of this is we have to respect that there's something inside of each one of us that knows us better than ourselves. And that's the soul. Now, when we use the word soul, that's the literal translation of the Greek word psyche, from which we get psychology, psychiatry, psychopharmacology, psychopathology, and so forth. And psychotherapy from the Greek means to listen or attend to the soul. So automatically you begin to see this is really about meaning, isn't it? Not about becoming better adjusted to the world around me, because if the world around me is sort of crazy and I adjust to it, what does that make me? And therefore, what we have to do, and this is not narcissism or self-absorption, it's about being accountable for what is wishing to come into this world through you. What the person you share with your children, with your partners, with your with your co-office workers and so forth. And in that ongoing dialogue between outer and inner world, we find most of the time in our culture, because of economic pressures, socialization pressures, we lose contact with that voice within. So however you experience that voice is how you have to become accountable to say, all right, I know what the world's asking me. See, that's the agenda of the first half of life. What do my parents want from me? What does the school teacher want from me? What does the employer want from me? What does the society around me want from me? And these are sometimes legitimate trade-offs, of course. That's how society functions. On the other hand, we neglect, through our adaptations and our behavioral and attitudinal changes, we neglect the voice within that also saying, but this is what really your interests are. This is what your soul is wishing from you. And again, it doesn't have to be grandiose. It has to do with simply sharing who you really are with people rather than living the facade of the adaptive persona that we all learn in childhood that is obligatory to function at school and so forth. So again, underneath all of this, there has to come some deep, deep respect for that candlelight inside of each of us, for lack of better terms. And if you don't, it will pathologize some way in the outer world through your children, through your relationships, through your own treatment of yourself, and so forth.
I keep thinking, I don't know why, because maybe I'm conditioned like that. When I'm thinking what my soul wants, it always goes to career, what kind of career or you should follow. And then I'm asking a question like, how does the soul know in my 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 today's reality what professions are? For example, how does it know that I want to be a filmmaker, for example? Because
Well,
uh,
let me ask you this
mm,
question.
yeah,
Forgive the interruption. What in you makes you want to make films?
I don't know really, but it's something that drives me. I cannot even explain it.
Okay, well, that's good enough. You don't have to explain it. You have to respect it. You have to recognize it, first of all, and you have to explain it. That's why I said to you a few moments ago, when I was a child, and I was a child during World War II, and I was perfectly safe in the middle of a continent far from the war, but I knew the world around me was not safe, and I saw there was immense suffering and anxiety in the world. And so I was hungry to learn what that was about. I was hungry to learn about what the world's about and to address certain questions. So my heroes were not cowboys on the movie screen, although they were intriguing. It was rather my teachers who I thought knew something, and they were there to share it with me. And I thought, how marvelous that is. Now, I'm giving you a kind of report about this later. As a child, I was simply drawn to it. You see, that autonomy of your own psyche has just said to you that filmmaking is something that calls you. That's what the word vocation means, vocatus, from the Latin vocal, to be called. And it's not about a job. Now, if you get paid for it, that's just a bonus. I'm not getting paid for our interview today. This is part of my teaching function. That's why I'm happy to do it. But I love teaching because I love learning. And when we talk, I'm called upon to draw from within me. So what do you think really? What do you feel really? And I have to add that word really because, our first response to questions like that are reflexive responses, are conditioning by our society. But that's why I can say over time, I was able to make a living through the vocation of teaching in the classroom. I still teach online. I consider therapy a form of education. And of course, I do these kinds of interviews and so forth, um, all of which serves that vocation. And at some level, I think part of the calling came from seeing the hardships and suffering of people around me when I was a child. So I thought anything that would help their condition, anything that would improve their lives or give them a perspective on things or give them a sense of their own worth and value is important to me. And it continues to be important after all this time. So I deliberately ask you that question, why do you want to make film? Because the truth is you can't answer it. You just know it intuitively. Something in me is calling me to engage people, engage the world through this medium that I can then share with others. Now, someone else, it might be the work of their hands. This has nothing to do with job per se. It has to do with, again, that inner sense that this is important for me, or this is something that, you know, lights that fire within me. Because the real question is what continues over time to call to you that raises interest in you or stirs some response within you. Those promptings, as I said before, often tend to get overruled in our necessary adaptation to the world out there. But when we forget that we have a summons to that kind of conversation, that's how we lose our own soul, so to speak. It's never gone. It's still within us, and that's when it will pathologize through depression or self-medication or a life of busyness. The treatment plan that modern culture has for people who are separated from their souls is materialism. Go buy some new shiny thing. And for a brief moment, you're distracted from your life. You're distracted from whatever depression that's asking you to address, or You're distracted from a sense of accountability for some changes in your life. And you can carry that off only so long until something begins to sicken inside of a person. That's what tends to bring people into therapy. Once in a while, people come into therapy because they're truly sort of curious about, well, I wonder what my dreams might mean, that sort of thing. But over time, if we don't pay attention to what is seeking expression through me, it will pathologize, be passed on to our children unconsciously, or we wind up in some way adrift in a materialist culture. It's full of noise and sound and distraction.
And on that topic, why we do what we do, how does the person differentiate? Is it truly mine, or I'm doing it's like socially conditioned? It's for attention, for fame, or
Mhm. Well, and I think that's a very important question. A question I often ask people in therapy of a certain choice in their life, certain behavior, certain stuck place. All right, but what is that in service to inside of you? And I don't want to trust your first answer because your first answer will be the conditioned response. Well, I did this because of this and this and this, or I have to take care of this over here. For example, I've had a significant number of physicians as clients through the years and a significant number of lawyers through the years. Almost 100% of them have been depressed, partly by the conditions of their work life, but more importantly, it wasn't necessarily a true calling. It was a response to social pressures, family expectations, economic considerations, things of that sort. It wasn't really a calling. One lawyer I knew that I worked with recognized that he'd become a lawyer to please his parents, essentially. And what he really loved was teaching. And he started a private school, a nonprofit private school for children in another part of the country. Of course, everybody around him thought he'd lost his mind. But what he'd done is found his soul, so to speak. And last I heard, was loving his work. Now, the point was, he found what he loved and was willing to give himself to it. At the same time, fitting in, earning a living, all of these practical demands out there are real too. And so we have to balance it. Often people have said to me, well, do you think I should do this? Or do you think I should do that? And I would say, yes, find out a way to do both, right? Maybe you need to earn a living. We all do, right? So earn a living, be a butcher, be a painter, be a streetcar conductor, whatever it takes to pay your bills. It's part of being a responsible adult. But don't forget you have a soul somewhere else. And I didn't fully add the point that you were just touching on here, and that is, especially for men, but increasingly for women too, that calling has always meant job or even profession. Your calling could be in the field of human relationships, the degree that you open yourself up to relationship and that you share who you are with people. This is not about building a resume. That's careerism, and there may be a place for it in the life of some people, but for a lot of people, it's a diversion of energy. It's like, who are you? And does this ultimately serve what is wanting that person to emerge from within you? So the psyche always knows what's right for us. And I certainly don't want to sound too idealistic here and say we can always live that easily. In fact, living it might be very costly. When I left academia years ago, it was at Midlife. I left a tenured professorship, which was hard to get and guaranteed lifetime salary and benefits and so forth. Went out entirely on my own, built a practice from nothing, and was grateful to have the opportunity to do that, and I was deeply in debt, paying for retraining, which I did in Zurich, Switzerland at the Jung Institute, was extremely costly, emotionally and financially in other ways. And yet something inside knew this is the path that I need to follow. I don't quite know where it's going, but it feels somewhere important for me to pursue that path. There was a passage in the Grail legends where the knights had seen this image of the Grail, which for them was a symbol of the sacred. And the text says each one then knew within him what his life was about, the search for, what was holy. And so they go to sleep that night, they wake in the morning, they break their fast, then they depart. And then the text says, each one took himself to a place in the woods where there was no path, for it would be a shameful thing to take the path that someone has taken before.
Hmm.
Now, that from about the 12th century was addressing intuitively the notion that each of us has to find our way through the forest of choices that lie before us. And it's not selfish if you decide what your path is. There's another old saying, and that is uh, two big questions in life, and try not to get them in the wrong order. What is my journey, and with whom do I travel? And of course, young people are intimidated, understandably, by that, by the magnitude of that question. So we'll often, hang on to somebody else, and then realize down the line, well, this is, it was a choice, with all due respect, based on the anxiety of being alone or not knowing who I was or where I was going. Then that puts the crisis on the marital relationship, for example, or the partnership. And that's a different question that comes up. And of course, in the field of relationship, I'll take a sidebar here for a moment. The purpose of a relationship is to support the growth and development of each of the parties. If I support my wife's journey and she supports mine, we both grow and develop. And it's a very loving thing to do for another person. But if that growth is stymied or blocked or came out of a bad place in a person's psychic life, it's not going to be a good outcome ultimately. So we have to remember in 1900 in the Western world, the average length of life was 47. So for many people, their 20s was midlife. And now when we have people routinely living into their 80s, we'd have to say, all right, the first half of life is about creating a life out there, building a relationship, starting a career, et cetera, et cetera. But then it has to come back to you, that central question, but who are you? What is this journey about for you as you experience it? And again, that doesn't mean one has to go off and live in the South Pacific or something like that, as Gauguin did. But one has to decide what is my soul calling me to value? And how do I mobilize the resourcefulness and the courage to try to express that value? And when you do that, your life, comes alive again. And if it's right for you, something inside of you will emerge. Now, many times for people, it's like meeting a new person. Having a romantic relationship will quicken that within a person, and that's understandable. But you can't confuse your journey with that particular feeling because you're still going to have to decide what your journey is about. And it's not about fusing with someone else's journey. As again, the difference is a healthy relationship is kind of like an open-ended structure where you support the growth and development of both parties. And, if that means this person has to go and undertake this course of development in some way, a new career, a new education, whatever, then you support them doing it and vice versa. So it's not easy, but if in a sense we are making choices that violate the integrity of your own soul, it's always going to pathologize in some way. It'll show up symptomatically in the relationship, in the body, in troubling dreams, and so forth.
And to touch on that, it's like a vicious cycle because when my body gives me symptoms, I'm weaker, I'm more unable to do the work. and then it goes even further. I'm still avoiding the work, and it's like a vicious cycle going down, and it should be stopped at some point. Otherwise, I can understand where it may lead some people.
Sure. Well, and folks need to know that when these moments occur, don't use it to judge yourself. Don't use it to beat up on yourself. Say, I know what that's about, and I still have to live my truth. Again, in with respect to others as well. I'm not talking about narcissism here, but for example, I'm a very deep introvert. Really, I could have been a monk somewhere. But I also knew that relationship was important and life in the outer world was important. So before I have any kind of presentation to give, a class to teach, or an interview like this, I feel in the body weak. I feel I have no energy. My complex says, you have nothing to say. Everybody knows this stuff anyhow. What are you wasting your time for? Just shut up and go away. Now, by this point, and you think, well, if you're 85, shouldn't you have gotten rid of that by now? No, you don't get rid of what was planted in your life by fate, but you can outgrow it. That was Jung's point. We don't solve these life issues, but we can outgrow their influence. So it doesn't keep me from being present to you at this moment. So when you mention the physical feeling before certain tasks, I know that well. I know it for what it is. I label it and I know I'll get through it. And if I am stopped by that old voice that comes from my family of origin, then something else will be even worse. I will have walked away from my calling. That's not acting in good faith. What Sartre called, bonne foi, good faith with your own psyche. Because when you do, something inside supports you. And when you don't, something inside begins to pathologize. It will always show up symptomatically somewhere else. So these things don't go away, they just go somewhere. That's why when I ask the question of people, well, what was that choice in service to inside of you? Now, the truth is, and it's going to sound horribly reductionistic, but it's so often true. Many of our behaviors are understandably fear-based responses because we learn early as children, and it's factual. The world's big and you're not. The world's powerful and you're not. So how are you going to deal with that for a few decades? Well, we have basic strategies. One is avoidance. Stay away from whatever feels difficult or threatening to us, or give them what they want, give them what they want. And that's how a child learns to adapt itself. Or some children kick into a power complex. I've got to control others, you see. And that shows up in their later parenting and relational life. And so all of that is the dominance of the child's early perspective. I've often said to people, you would never allow your child to drive your automobile because the 8-year-old can't even see over the dashboard and can see out the window. You wouldn't do it. But the choice you just made came from that 8-year-old inside of you. Can you begin to identify? It's not so much what you choose, it's what it's in service to inside of you. And a lot of those choices come out of, and understandably, come out of the fears of childhood, the fears of being overwhelmed by something, it's too big for me to handle, or the fears of abandonment. I mean, I can't tell you how many people I've seen in relationships that were not healthful for them, but they were terrified of being alone, which I understand. If a child is alone, it can perish. But you see, that keeps us stuck in the child's perspective. And, we are the animal that has to be protected the longest in all of nature's child rearing process. But at the same time, we have within us the resources of human nature, the capacity for self-sufficiency. We are guided by these internal systems, or at least they're operative within each of us, and we have a core resilience That's why this species has been able to survive on this planet. But at the same time, we always feel that vulnerability of the child within. As one woman said to me who was in a terrible relationship, I won't let go of that hand in the darkness till there's another hand for me.
Mhm.
I understand it was the terror of abandonment because she'd experienced that as a child. At the same time, as I said, we wouldn't allow our inner child to drive the automobile, but we do that all the time in the conduct of daily life. So therein, once you become conscious of that, there is another level of accountability that says, well, I can now identify this. Again, psychology, and Jung pointed this out in a letter he wrote in the 1950s. He said, the work of individuation or becoming who you are as a person consists of three parts, of which psychology can only help with the first part, and that's to give insight. Then he said, come the moral qualities of the individual. Second is courage to face one's life. And thirdly is endurance, persistence, sticking it out over time. Insight, courage, endurance. That's how we grow. That's how we change. That's why when I was at times alone, minus family, penniless in Zurich, I also knew why I was there. I was there because it was something important to me to find out what was going on inside so that I could make choices from a better perspective in the outer world. And I came close to it, but I never quite lost that thread that said, if it's difficult for you, well, just keep moving forward till you find what its meaning for you happens to be. So again, we come back to that question. What are my choices in service to really? Again, I say really because we can't trust our first response. It's an old protection, there for good reason. But if I try to remove the protective agenda and say, but what is that really in service to? Does this path make me larger as a human being, or does it diminish me in some way? And I think usually we know the answer to that question. And if you choose the path of psycho-spiritual enlargement, then your life has purpose and meaning. It's alive. It's interesting. And if you don't, there's something inside that always knows we were living in bad faith with our own souls. And that's not a good place to be, I can tell you.
Well, there are so many interesting and profound things to um, soak in. I
Mhm.
want to ask you so many questions and so many interesting things. I can't even choose, but you touched upon ignoring that part of your childhood which doesn't know yet, like 80 years old, can't drive. You should not trust as an adult that thinking. But also, as they say, you should listen to your inner child, and it's like a paradox where you have to differentiate which part of the child to listen to, because one of it is an authentic, another one is scared and conditioned. Uh,
May I just interrupt?
yeah.
I think your point is well taken, that you're reminding us that when we talked about the 8-year-old driving your automobile, that's one aspect of it. The other part of it is the child that you once were knew what was important for you. And I mentioned briefly, as a child, I wanted to know, why is there war? Why do people suffer? Why am I here? How am I to live my journey? What is it that is meaningful and productive for me? Those questions are part of who we are. And when we forget those questions, then we lose contact with what is most vital within us. That's why I said my school teachers were so heroic to me, because they began to give me more information, yes, but also began to open a larger world. And so did books, as a matter of fact, too. I love to read. So they all open the door to life as a journey. It's not an arrival, it's a journey that matters. If you keep growing and developing. I just finished the manuscript for my 21st book. And the reason I continue to write, because it's not easy, I write at the end of a workday. I could sit and watch a movie with my wife or something, and I do on the weekends, but on weekdays, I usually write. And I do that because I don't know what I'm thinking, feeling, what my perspective on something is until I'm forced to bring it up from somewhere below. It's literally a discovery process. It's literally a learning process for me. And because of that, it's tied to my growth, my psychological and my spiritual growth is writing. I'm not saying everybody else should write. Their pathway is again through their curiosity about flowers or their work of their hands or their relationships to other people and so forth. So again, something in that child that we were carries for us the secret. In Jung's memoir, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, which is a very readable book, and I commend it to everybody, he says at the end of his life, when he was at my age, when he was conducting that interview, uh, I have no grand truths to proclaim, but I'll say two things. One, the person I am today is somehow the same person I was as a child. There's that thread of continuity that runs through all of us. And he said, I know there's some kind of energy, and he doesn't name it, some kind of energy that has carried me and sustained me through all of this journey. And I would say of those two criteria, the same thing. I'm not going to make grand truths here because whatever I think and feel and believe today can be contradicted tomorrow by some larger experience or some new insight. That's why I keep at it. But I can say the child I was is the same as this elderly person. And secondly, some energy has carried me, which is mysterious at heart. You know, it's the life force. And it still quickens with interest when there's something new to learn from astronomy or from physics. Even though I lack the technical skills in those areas, I'm delighted to be part of a world where we can share those insights and so forth. And also to discover the beauty of the simple. I was pretty crippled a couple of years ago as a result of my surgeries, but today in addition to, domestic walking, I walk a mile a day out in nature, and I try to observe minutely the changes in the trees and the vegetation around the calendar year and pay attention to that. Because in those moments, I'm pulled out of the stresses of daily life into something really timeless. That's something going on through eternity. This picture behind me here, the White Cliffs of Dover, I'd heard about them in a song from World War II. Soon we'll be over the White Cliffs of Dover. So that represented for me a kind of
Mm.
symbol of things to encounter out there. And there's something timeless in those cliffs of Dover there. And, I could have I live in a suburb of Washington, D.C. I can have a picture of of Washington, D.C. here with all its busyness and so forth. But this is what's there because this is a reminder of the timeless, of the eternal. And we are of that soul stuff as well, the nature of which I don't presume to know, but that's what keeps me curious about it. So again, I think curiosity, what sparks your interest, what causes you to question, oh, I wonder about that, think about that. See, we become dulled through our adaptations. And I guess 95% of our life is on automatic pilot, where we just stimulus response, stimulus response, stimulus response. We can get through life unconsciously. But that's a waste of this journey, isn't it? We have to ask why, in service to what? How am I best to spend my energy? What keeps me from doing that? Those are the kind of questions that come up in therapy on a daily basis.
I wanted to ask you about suffering. Um, As Jung says, inauthentic suffering is when you are not serving your soul and you're suffering anyway in life,
Mhm.
right? But when I think about it, when I'm doing what I like to do or what I'm called to do, it is so much fun. There's so much playfulness to it and so much enjoyment that it even surpasses the suffering, maybe. That's what they call the authentic suffering, maybe, right? Because it's hard to do, it's still hard to do, but it feels different.
You're right. You're right. And you made an important distinction. You know, you'll suffer regardless. We are deeply sentient beings. We feel things. Um, Inauthentic. So we'll just use the example I gave you. If I gave in to my neurosis, because I came from a family pretty much overwhelmed by poverty and lack of education. My father was pulled out of grade school and sent to work because of the Great Depression and so forth. And if I gave in to that voice that would shut me down, I'll suffer. But that's inauthentic suffering. Authentic suffering is to show up in life, show enter it, dive into it in some way, because then your life is developmental rather than regressive. Then new things come to you. You know, the payment for that is, your own spiritual enlargement. As you said, there's a certain enjoyment from the journey as well, even in the midst of suffering. I do not enjoy sitting with people hour by hour in therapy, listening to human suffering, but it's profoundly meaningful for me to do that. And that completely transcends any reservations I might have for doing that work. That's why I'm still working in my ninth decade, because it's still meaningful work to me. And it's an honor for me to be invited into someone's life to share their suffering. I do feel it after all this time. I'm not clinically detached, but I share that suffering, but it's meaningful to be part of that process. And underneath that, you have to say, all right, that's not a choice the ego makes. That's made somewhere deeper within a person. That's made by the soul. Whatever engages you so much that in some way it might even hurt, but that hurt is transformed by the experience itself, by the pleasure that it brings you from a kind of enlargement in your journey. And that's going to vary from each person. I mean, I don't want this to sound intellectual. I don't want this to sound idealistic. For many people, it's in the quality of their presence in relationships. For some people, the act of courage in their life is just to show up in life in the face of their fears. We can't know that necessarily from outside, but they have to go through a struggle. And I have enormous compassion for people who struggle because I saw my parents overwhelmed by that. And I realized something inside of me that carried the same fears, the same inhibitions, but that if I gave in to them, that would be inauthentic suffering. And authentic suffering means you have to step into it in some way and bring your best to that. And when you do that, it's a profoundly meaningful experience. And that's what your life is about, is what is the best and most meaningful way to do it. And it's clearly more than just being an economic animal, right? Or a person who is a good citizen or whatever. That our roles may be good or bad, and if you don't like your roles, maybe it's time to change them, but that's not what your life's about. It's what your soul is called to. That's a different question.
I wanted to touch on the transitioning from one adulthood to the second one. When there's a certain death of the first adulthood, and if it doesn't happen, how it hinders your life in the next stage. Because in our culture, which is so family oriented, it's not economically very developed. So people live with their parents And I can see that despite the age, this transitioning into the second adulthood does not happen, and it creates a myriad of problems. If you
Mhm.
could talk about that.
You could say that the roadmap of the first half of life is about developing enough ego strength to leave your parents, if not physically, at least psychologically, and choose differently. The question is, apart from the economic pressures there, is that a healthful relationship? Do you grow and develop? Or are you always having to sort of report to the other, you see? And if it's that, then it's going to be stifling to your soul over time. And that's paying some some heavy price because that invariably leads to depression and anger and self-medication sooner or later. You can say there's a continuity of families there, but that's not always a good thing because what does that do to the psychological life of each individual? Are they served by that or are they inhibited and contained by that? So if you have a map of Georgia and it works while you're in Georgia, don't expect it to work when you're in Ukraine or in Bolivia or Argentina. It's like you're often at midlife, there's this internal stress that people have called the midlife crisis. It's where the conflict that has been brewing for many years inside of you reaches the surface in a marital discord, in a depression, in self-medication, or loss of meaning and purpose, whatever form it takes, or physical illness even. And it's because the psyche is no longer willing to put up with being ignored, being abused, perhaps. And so in the second half of life, the task really then is, as we've said before, now what is the soul asking me? I've served what is the world asking of me? I built a career. I was in my mid 30s. I had a university post that was very desirable and I appreciated. But I also knew something was missing in my life. And I think I was living too much upstairs and not enough down here in the heart and soul. And I had to experience my own descent before I was going to be present to the experience of others there. And so for each person, it's different. And once in a while, people will just find, someone says, when I've just always been interested in being a sculptor, or I'd like to go watch birds, or whatever their interests are, and they just learn early that's something that gives me a sense of fulfillment. Well, they're fortunate.
Mhm.
Once in a while, you meet somebody who's had a sense of that from the early days of their life. But for most people, we have to respond to the social demands, economic demands, and so forth, and then have to say, all right, now how is this working for what's going on inside of me? And that's where the conversation begins. You can carry that off through adaptation for the first years of your life, but not forever. And to choose a kind of cliche, but it's a cliche because it's repeatedly true. So many people at the end of their life will not be saying, oh, I wish I'd spent more time in the office. They'll say, I wish I'd spent more time with my family, or I wish I would have spent more time exploring what I wanted to explore. One of the first things I did as a young adult was to go see the White Cliffs of Dover, just because I'd
Mhm.
heard about it as a child. So it's like, all right, what are you waiting for? We're here a short time. What is it that matters to you? What still lights that spark? And that's when you realize the old roadmap doesn't work anymore. I need to find a new roadmap, but it's being prompted by something inside rather than responding to the pressures and expectations of that which lies outside of me. Pleasure
Uh,
talking with you, and I wish you well, and I appreciate that you're following your calling, which I admire.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this interview, and I wish you all the best, Dr. Hollis.
Thank you very much. Be well.
Thank you. You too. Bye.
Mhm.